In this video, we will be discussing bias. So, bias is something that can happen when you are collecting data. So, there are several sources of bias. First is sampling bias. So, when the sample is not representative of the population, you get sampling bias. So, for example, if your population is 50% female and 50% male, and then you take a sample and your entire sample is female, well, that sample is probably not going to represent your population because it's only the females. Voluntary response bias. So this is the sampling bias that often occurs when the sample is volunteers. So if you just ask for people, like in a restaurant, you just let anyone volunteer to give feedback. The problem with that is that you're more than likely going to only get the extremes. So the person who is extremely happy or satisfied because maybe the server gave them a free dessert or whatever the case is, or you have the customer who's very angry because their food was cold, the waiter was rude, and so those are going to be the people who are going to take the time to fill out the survey. You're not going to get a representative sample because maybe you only have one extreme or the other per day and all the rest are just average, and so they don't take the time to fill out the survey. A self-interest study, bias that can occur when the researchers have an interest in the outcome. So this you will often see if a company is paying for research. So maybe a company who produces candy does a study to show that sugar does not cause diabetes and sugar is not related to adverse health outcomes. They have a self-interest in promoting that sugar isn't that unhealthy. So that would be an example of that. Response bias, when the responder gives inaccurate responses for any reason. So maybe they don't want to tell the truth because they're embarrassed. They don't want to admit something. For example, there's a lot of stigma on getting mental health treatment. So maybe if your questionnaire is asking the participant if they have ever been treated for mental illness, they may say no because they don't want to out themselves. Perceived lack of anonymity. This is when the responder fears giving an honest answer might negatively affect them. So, for example, maybe a teacher is giving a survey to her students and she wants them to tell her, let's say, if she's doing a good job or not. Maybe she wants feedback on her lectures. Students, do you think I'm boring? Well, the student might not want to say, yes, you're boring, because they think that giving an honest answer might cause them to have a bad grade. Non-response bias, when people refusing to participate in the study can influence the validity of the outcome. So this might be if you have groups that you're trying to get in order to represent your population. Let's say you have a small Indigenous American group and maybe you have sample 2. So you have 2 Indigenous Americans that you sent out surveys to, and neither of them respond to your survey. So that's going to significantly influence your study, or it could, because an entire group didn't respond. Loaded questions, when the question wording influences the responses. So perhaps you have kind of a compound question or 2 questions in one where it's kind of confusing and having people answer the wrong way. Or it could be the way it's worded causes people to answer more positively when maybe they don't feel as positively as they say they do. So let's look at some examples, and in each situation, we're going to identify a potential source of bias. So number 1, a survey asks how many sexual partners a person has had in the last year. So this could be an example where you have response bias. So historically, men are likely to overreport and women are likely to underreport to this question. And if you look back at the response bias, when the responder gives inaccurate responses for any reason. Number 2, a radio station asks readers to phone in their choice in a daily poll. So this is a voluntary response bias. So they're just asking for volunteers to call in, and you're only going to get the people who are very interested in whatever poll this radio station is taking. Number 3, a substitute teacher wants to know how students in the class did on their last test. The teacher asks the students sitting in the front row to state their latest test score. So this could be a sampling bias. And let's go back up and look at the options here. The sampling bias, it's not representative of the population. So it could be that if the students choose where they sit. So if the students choose where they sit, oftentimes the students who care more about the course are going to sit in the front. So they get the most attention, they have good access and view of the board. So it could be a sampling bias because maybe the students get to pick where they sit. If they don't, you could also have a perceived lack of anonymity, because if they're having to say that out loud, it's obviously not going to be anonymous. So that could be it as well. Number 4, high school students are asked if they have consumed alcohol in the last 2 weeks. So this could be the lack of anonymity. I mean, if they think that you're going to tell their parents that they've been drinking, they're probably not going to admit to drinking. So that would be that one. Number 5, the Beef Council releases a study stating that consuming red meat poses little cardiovascular risk. So this is going to be a self-interest. This is similar to the example I gave about sugar. Okay, and number 6, a poll asks, do you support a new transportation tax, or would you prefer to see our public transportation system fall apart? So this is an example of a loaded question. Just because you don't support the transportation tax doesn't mean you want the system to fall apart. So it's making it seem very negative if you say no. So this would be an example of a loaded question. This information was taken from the college mathematics textbook from Scottsdale Community College. It is an open and free resource online.